Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to another edition of the Kitchings Table here on Awesome Radio, the 106.9, WBISLP, GPAC 23, Roku TV, Facebook Live, and YouTube. We are welcoming you all to another edition of our programming here, and hopefully you get something out of our shows every Tuesday morning here at 10 o'clock. And today, being that it is Women's History Month, I felt a urge to do something about women, which would correlate to me wanting to do something about women in the military, a segment that we probably don't talk about often, about our women in the military, especially women of color, African American, Black women who have served and are serving in our military branches. And I would just like to share those stories and or information with you about those ladies. But before I get started on our first segment this morning, Black women in the U.S. military, I wanted to share a photograph with you of a relative, and that is my aunt. Let's see if I get, there we go. That is a picture of my aunt, and she was in the military back in the 50s, and she was an officer, and she was in that segment of the United States Navy called the Waves. The Waves. And I'm doing this in honor of her. She is no longer with us, but let me tell you, she was one intelligent, smart, tough individual who didn't play the radio. And I think her military experience helped to make her a little bit more stronger and stringent in the ways she would do things. But I'm proud of her because realizing that she served the United States in the military, in the Navy, in a branch where women weren't really considered to be a part of or didn't get many opportunities. I guarantee you, had she stayed in the Navy, she probably could have gone and been one of the top officers in the United States Navy at that time. So I'm going to go over the three areas of the military that served America in the era of maybe World War II, a little bit of World War I, but more of World War II and beyond. And there were three areas that women served in during this time. And they were called the WASP, the Waves, and the WACS. The WASP, WASP, small s, the Waves, WAVES, and the WACS, WAAC, small s. Each one of them played an important role in the military, and the stories that I will share with you about ladies who impacted the Waves and the WACs probably will astonish you. But the WASP were the Women Air Force Service Pilots, and they were an integral part of the World War II effort. When men left to fight, plane manufacturers still needed to test the plane, so they relied on women pilots to train in the United States to fly the planes that were going to be used in battle. Then there was the WAVES, or the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, WAVES. They entered the war as part of the United States Navy, and they were given the same type of commissions that naval officers had, and they served very proudly. As I showed you the picture of my aunt, let me tell you, that was a stylish outfit. That dark navy blue jacket with that dark navy blue brim with the white crown to the hat, that was pretty sharp, and she looked pretty sharp in that uniform, in person and in color. And as you can see, from a black and white, it still has a dramatic effect. But they were accepted into the ranks, mainly for clerical roles and nurses, but not as officers. But after a 23-year break, women returned to general service in 1942. And then there's the WACS, the Women Army Auxiliary Corps, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And they were the first women other than nurses to serve in the ranks of the United States Army. And they were established to work with the Army for the purpose of making available to the national defense the knowledge, skill, and special training of the women of the nation. The WACS, the WAVES, the WASP. These women, my hats go off to you. I salute each and every one of you, both living and deceased, for your efforts, for your time given, for your service, and for the honor you gave in doing your job in very tough conditions, especially those women of color who served, because of course they had to go the extra yard, the extra mile to serve in their typical fashion. And I salute each and every one of them because they carried on with honor, dignity, glory. So the WASP, who dealt with training or test piloting planes, the WAVES, who dealt with working throughout the naval areas, and then the WACS, who worked in the Army. Those were the three branches of the women's service during World War II. So I ran across some articles about those areas, specifically the WACS and the WAVES. And I ran across the fact that there were 4 women of color during World War II who really pushed the envelope to make sure that the Army did what it was supposed to do in supporting women of color, allowing them to serve. And they did their jobs very, very well. So I'm going to give you some timelines, information about these women, and some of the books that were written about them. Blazing Trails and Taking Names, that was a blog that talks about women in the service, women on corps. Charity Adams Early, the National Women's History Museum, the commanding officer of the first unit of the WAC African American who went overseas. She served in the 68th, 88th Central Postal Directory Battalion. Then there was Cathay Williams. She was a female Buffalo soldier, and she enlisted as a male under the name William Cathay in the United States Army at St. Louis in the 38th United States Infantry Company, A, with Charles Clark as the captain and commanding. Then in 1942, the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, agreed to reopen the Navy to African-American women in 1944. Not since World War I had African-American women been permitted to serve. A white-only service, the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Services, was the essential branch of the Navy, and they selected 2 capable African-American recruits, Harriet Ida Pickens and Frances Eliza Willis, 2 accomplished women from New York, and I'll talk more about them later. Then there was the I-2M Rosie, which was in the National Archives and Records Administration. And of course, for many of you who may or may not know, Rosie the Riveter were women who went into the factories to help manufacture military planes, vehicles, whatever was needed to be made. These women came to service in the industries, in the manufacturing division, and helped make a lot of the war equipment that was used in World War II. Then the lesson plan, which was about American women in the military during World War II under President Truman, and he signed an executive order in 1948, number 9981, establishing the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Forces, committing the government to desegregating the military. First Black Wax, that was another book. This article was about those same Black women. And the list of these articles and books goes on and on and on. And these women served in the areas of every place you can think of. There was also a book written about the Tuskegee Army nurses, and this nursing corps was available in World War II at the Tuskegee Army Airfield. And as you know, you've heard the story about the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, those gentlemen who provided cover for the bombers in World War II and never lost one bomber. In all the missions they served, they never lost a bomber in their missions. An extraordinary record. Up until those men started providing cover for those bombers, the United States Army Air Force was losing airplanes like you wouldn't believe. They could not finish missions. They could not drop bombs where they needed to because the planes were being destroyed by the German Air Force. And then the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, took to the air and everything changed. And the two movies that have been out about those men, the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails, show what their mission was, how they delivered, how they served with dignity and honor, but the things they had to go through. But again, the women who served in our military branches have gone on to serve proudly. And in our second segment today, we're going to talk about the military academies and what's going on with the military academies here in the United States, because a lot of great things are happening for women in our military academies. And they're going on to serve in high officer positions, serving as fighter pilots, serving as brigadier commanders in their cadet corps, and graduating in numbers now. The number of women who are going to our military academies and serving. But our women have been serving in the military for many, many years. So the next thing I would like to share with you this morning in our first segment of our show today, Black Women in the United States Military, is the integration of the WAVES and the Navy's first female American officers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Harriet Pickens and Ensign Frances Willis were the first women. Let me show you their picture. There you go. Of color to serve as officers in the United States Navy. And not since World War I, as I said, were these women allowed to serve. So President Roosevelt ordered what is called a breakthrough in the commissioning of the Navy's first two African-American female officers. In great haste, the leaders of the WAVES were Miss Pickens and Miss Willis. Between 1942 and 1944, the WAVES did not service African-American women. And then in July 42, public law, which amended the Naval Reserve Act of 1938, sanctioned the inclusion of women in the Naval Reserve. The rationale was to expedite the war effort by releasing officers and men for duty at sea and their replacement by women in the shore establishment of the Navy. So the WAVES were basically not going into battle, but they were serving our military branch of the Navy here at home, in places in the military bases, naval bases around the country. And they went from civilian life to military life. And although this Public Law 689 was passed in 1942, it was passed on a discriminatory level. And the rationale for the law suggests that the temporary and extraordinary parameters of women inclusion in the reserve, while the law itself issued a litany of restrictions and double standards, it provided these things did not provide these things. Only one woman would attain the rank of lieutenant commander. No woman would advance any higher than that. No more than 35 women would advance to lieutenant. The number of lieutenants, junior grade, would not exceed 35% of the total of the commissioned officers in the WAVES. Female officers would only exercise authority over other women. I'm an officer, but I can only tell women what to do. I couldn't tell a male what to do. The female officer's purview would never extend beyond the waves. The women would only serve on shore and within the continental United States, and the law barred them specifically from duty on aircraft and vessels. So they could not be on planes and they could not serve on ships. And then finally, the female reservists would be ineligible for positions in the shore establishment open as a result of male civil servants mobilization. So you can see there was a fight to be had, not just for women of color, but women who just wanted to serve this country. However, the fight would be a battle. It would be a battle. And as women of color became more interested in wanting to serve this country, wanting to serve on the front lines, wherever that front line would be, on shore here in the country, at the military or naval bases, they were ready to serve. Historian Maury Klein notes that racial prejudice simply festered in the background in the first part of the war, but burst forth in all its ugliness in 1943. The imprisonment of so many Japanese Americans, the increasing violence against Hispanic Americans, and the continued persecution of African Americans constituted a wave of white supremacy that was so deplorable as it was detrimental to the war effort. Now, you're fighting an evil force overseas that in the war effort propagated by the leader of Germany at that time, Adolf Hitler. And then you need all the manpower you can get to do whatever you can do to help build planes, build weapons. You need all the help you can get, but yet you choose to continue to have this mindset that people of color are not valued enough to do some of the work or serve in some of the capacities. Pressure from African American rights organizations ultimately succeeded in persuading the Navy to allow African American men to serve as Seabees. Now, you may not have heard of Seabees. Seabees is that construction corps in the Navy that builds things, roads, bridges, things of that nature. To serve as Seabees for general shore duty by 1942, but the officer corps remained off limits. Again, you can serve, but your service is limited. We're not going to give you the rights as an American to serve your country where you can do the most good. We're going to continue to make sure you serve in limited capacities. As early as May of 1942, African American leaders were appealing to the Senate Naval Affairs Committee to draft legislation forbidding racial discrimination in the Women's Reserve. But that didn't help either. So Secretary of the Navy, William F. Cox, was a determined opponent of African American advancement, though eventually the NAACP and others, including the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, persuaded him to allow the admission of African American men to the Navy's officer corps in early 1944. It took some work, it took some time, but when you have faith, when you have people who believe in what is right, as Eleanor Roosevelt showed so many times, whether it was for the Navy, whether it's for the Army, it did not matter. This woman fought for the right and the just way of doing things in this country. So in 44, Knox let an African American get their turns. And they produced the first African American officers in the Navy. And as African Americans applied serious pressure to the legislature and officials in the form of petitions, public relations actions, and letter writing campaigns, female African American activists worked tirelessly with Mildred McAfee, the head of the WAVES, to bring about African American women's inclusion in the WAVES on an integrated basis. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, who succeeded Knox, was no segregationist. He advocated the integration of the Navy and by extension of the WAVES because discrimination and segregation compromised efficiency. Listen to that part. Segregation and discrimination compromises efficiency. Now, if that was true in 1944, is it not true today? Discrimination and segregation. If you want to be efficient holistically. And in 1944, the campaign season when Roosevelt was seeking re-election, his opponent effectively politicized the issue of African American women into the WAVES by asking a crowd of African American voters why they even considered voting for a man who still refused to admit African American women to the Naval Reserve. It became clear to Roosevelt that he might lose African American voters should he fail to act swiftly. Therefore, on October 19, 1944, with the president's authorization, the Navy announced the decision to integrate its female reserve program. And on December 28, 1944, at Hunter College in New York City, WAVES began reporting for training. African American WAVES began reporting for training, 1944. From Massachusetts, Minnesota, Illinois, New York, Georgia, Alabama, the recruits integrated the Navy for the females in the WAVES. In early 1945, they reported to integrated duty stations across the country. But the Navy refused to tolerate any backlash from white WAVES, the more vocal of whom were forced out of the service entirely with neuropsychic discharges. And they got discharged. Still, instances of hostility and everyday indignities came and went with some frequency. However, it did not stop Miss Pickens or Miss Willis from going forth. Pickens was born in Talladega, Alabama, to distinguished parents. Her father had been one of the founders of the NAACP. She graduated at Smith College in Massachusetts before pursuing study at Columbia University and Bennett College for Women in North Carolina, and in 1934 became the supervisor of a large-scale recreation program maintained by Workers' Progress Administration of the Juvenile Aid Bureau of the City of New York. So these women distinguished themselves. And of course, if you're going to be an officer in the military right out of college, your degree basically accelerates your opportunity to serve in that capacity. So these women had their college degrees, and like my aunt, who graduated from Florida A&M University, when the opportunity allowed itself, their degree opened the door and gave them the opportunity to serve as officers and serve with pride and distinction. Now think about it. A fight to get in a fight. These women were fighting to get in a fight. They wanted their opportunity. They didn't want to be denied. They wanted the opportunity to show what they could do and show they could serve just as proudly and honorably as other women who were not of color. And that's what they did. So once again, Harriet, Ida Pickens, and Frances Wills, There they are. Miss Pickens is on the left and Miss Wills is on the right. These ladies, with honor and dignity, with respect, served in the waves and opened the door for many other women to come behind them, one being my aunt, Ernestine Fears was her maiden name. Ernestine Fears Hawkins was her married name, but she served with pride. Good morning again. This is the Kitchings Table here on 106.9 FM, Awesome Radio, WBISLP. Also seen on Facebook, YouTube, GPAC23, and Roku. We're so happy to be with you today. Our show segment today is Black Women in the U.S. Military, and we've shared with you the first part of our show today, and it dealt with the three segments of the military where women participated. The WASP, which was the Air Force part of it, where the women test flew planes. The WAVES, who were part of the Naval military, and that stood for the Women's Active Volunteer Emergency Service, and the WACS, which was part of the Army, which stood for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and they served in the Army and gave service as nurses and other strategic positions in the military. So it is now time for our pantry segment, where we give you a little bit more flavor to our show. And today's segment is the military timeline of Black women who have done their part, served their time in the United States military, all the way back to the Revolutionary War. All the way back then, Black women have served proudly and done their part. And if you need to just look into some of these things, please be my guest and go online and research it out to see what women have done, Black women have done, in order to be a part of the Americana of this country. We've served, we've given our blood, sweat, and tears, and the only thing that is continued to ask by people of color, not just Black people, but any people of color here in America, is a fair and just opportunity to serve and work. That's all. We're all Americans. Let everyone have an opportunity. But until we get rid of the segregation and discrimination of the mindsets of those people who believe it all belongs to them and nobody else can do anything but them, the fight will continue. And guess what? Quitters never win. So we're not quitting. So in the Revolutionary War, African-American women played major support roles during the colonial period by providing help to the militia. Their assistance included roles such as moving into the big house to support slave owners' wives when they went away to serve, taking care of wounds, working alongside the men in building forts for safety from the Indians and the British. They also served as spies, keeping the military abreast of what was going on by the British. According to Lucy Terry's written accounts of the war, Black women disguised themselves as men and fought side by side with them against the British and kept their homes so that white women could go near their husbands during these engagements. Phyllis Wheatley, a very literate Black woman, used her writing ability to praise and express appreciation for the Revolutionary War under George Washington. Then there was the War of 1812, which was basically a naval battle. Female assistance was limited to making bandages and tending the sick and wounded sailors. Additionally, Black women were able to take care of the farms so that the owners of the farms could leave their homes and go off to war. So the Revolutionary War, back in the late 1700s, 1774, 75, 76. Then the War of 1812, right up until the Civil War. And during the Civil War, one of America's greatest heroines is known by the name of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman. They called her Moses. If you haven't seen the movie, they called her Moses. She was an inspiration because she served as a Union spy, an unpaid soldier, a volunteer nurse, and a freedom fighter. She loved freedom so much that she left her family, her husband, her brothers behind when they chose not to run the risk of escaping for freedom. During the war, she earned the title of General Moses. Along with Harriet Tubman, Susan Kane Taylor became famous for her volunteer service during the Civil War. Again, she escaped slavery at the age of 12 and was teaching freedmen by the time she was 16. During that time, Taylor met Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, and that inspired her to become a volunteer nurse and laundered for Black Civil War troops as she traveled with her husband in the 33rd United States Colored Troops. She formed the Boston branch of the Women's Relief Corps after the war. And in her memoirs in 1902, when they were published, she became the only written record of Black volunteer nurses in the Civil War. That was the Civil War. Susan Taylor, Harriet Tubman, freedom fighters, nurses, doing their part. Then the Spanish-American War. Again, Black females played their role as nurses. 75% of all deaths in this war resulted from typhoid and yellow fever. Many Black female volunteer nurses were told they were immune to the disease because their skin was darker and thicker. Again, stereotypes and myths. However, these Black nurses, 32 of them, did their job, exposed themselves to the diseases, and helped those soldiers. However, many congressmen tried but failed to create a permanent corps of Army nurses. World War I, African American females had an official organization when they found leadership and direction to use their abilities. The National Association of Colored Graduated Nurses was founded in 1909. In 1917, the co-founder of the Red Cross urged Black nurses to enroll in the American Red Cross, although they were not accepted until 2 months before the war ended in November of 1918. Again, wanting to serve. African American females continued to serve by making bandages, taking over jobs that men had so they could be soldiers, working in hospitals and troop centers, and serving in other relief organizations as they had done in many previous wars. That was World War I. Then in World War II, the Army created the WACs, the Navy created the WAVs, the Coast Guard created the SPARs. The majority of African American women served in the WAC, which was the Army. And like today's military, as most men of color, African American men, and in the past have served in the Army, the women served there too. Although they remained in segregated units, the Navy intended to increase the number of African Americans to 10%. There were still less than 50 Black WAVs by 1950. The United States Coast Guard had even less in the SPARs. Out of the highest number of women in the military during this period, only 4,000 African American women served, simply because they just weren't given any opportunities. Black women continue to serve in the Korean conflict, through Vietnam, and Operation Desert Storm. Black women continue their service. And in Desert Storm, African American women served with distinction during Operation Desert Storm as officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted soldiers. Of the 35,000 females who went to Desert Storm, An estimated 40% of them were African Americans, according to Staff Sergeant Betty Brown of the Washington, D.C. Army National Guard. 40% of 35,000 females. That's probably 15,000 Black females serving. An African-American woman, Lieutenant Phoebe Jeter, who headed an all-male platoon, ordered 13 Patriot missiles fired, destroying at least 2 Scuds, which were Iraqi surface-to-air missiles. Another African-American woman, Cynthia Mosley, commanded the Alpha Company, 24th Support Battalion Forward, 24th Infantry Division, mechanized, a 100-person unit that supplied everything from fuel to water to ammunition. Her unit resupplied fuel for all of the 4 brigades because it was closest to the front lines. Women of color serving proudly. Then they had Ensign Matisse Wright, the Navy's first Black female naval flight officer, serving in the Navy, doing her part. Sergeant Danielle E. Wilson, the first Black woman to serve as a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Sentinel. And you know that is a proud unit of people, of military officers and soldiers who serve at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then there's Brigadier General Marcelite Jordan Harris, Director of Maintenance Headquarters, United States Air Force, retired. Brigadier General Clara Adams Ender and Brigadier General Sherian G. Godoria, all women of color. So let me give you a few military first on this timeline. 1945, Phyllis May Daly became the first Black nurse sworn into the Navy Nurse Corps in New York City. 1948, the first Black nurse joined the regular Army Nurses Corps. 1974, the Reverend Alice Henderson was commissioned as a chaplain, becoming the first female chaplain, Black or white, in the service. 1974, again, Black women out of a group of 15 became cadets at the United States Merchant Marine Academy. In 1975, Lieutenant Donna P. Davis became the first Black woman doctor in the Naval Medical Corps. In 1979, Second Lieutenant Marcella A. Hayes is the 55th woman out of 48,000 officers to graduate from the Army Aviation School in Fort Rucker, Alabama. She became the first Black woman pilot in the United States Armed Forces, Second Lieutenant Marcella A. Hayes. 1979, Hazel Johnson became the first Black woman promoted to the rank and position of Brigadier General, Chief of the Army Nursing Corps. 1980, Ensign Brenda Robinson became the first Black female aviator in the United States Navy, assigned to the Fleet Logistics Squadron 40 in Norfolk, Virginia. And in 1983, Angela Dennis of Arkansas became one of the first Black women to graduate from the United States Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. That is our pantry segment for today. Women and the timelines that they've served in our armed forces. They have served proudly. This is the Kitchings Table, heard every Tuesday morning and seen every Tuesday morning here on Awesome Radio 106.9 FM, WBISLP, Facebook Live, YouTube, Roku TV, and GPAC 23 are all mediums that carry the show. So if you miss one, check out the other and catch us every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. here on this great and powerful station. Shout out to Miss Akila Thigpen for all her support and help in making this show possible. And of course, Ronleen Kennedy for always providing her support in our efforts. So now our final segment, the second segment of our show today, Black Women in U.S. Military, deals with the military academies. The military academies. And the 3 military academies are West Point for the Army, Annapolis for the Navy, and it slips me now, but out in Colorado, the United States Air Force has their academy. And in order to get into these academies, you have to qualify. Some can get in by congressional recommendation. I had a young man who was in my Boy Scout troop when I was living in Atlanta, who graduated from high school. Then House of Representative Congressman John Lewis wrote him a recommendation, and he was basically taken into the Air Force Academy. And he served 1 year there before coming back to Georgia and receiving his medical degree. He is now a doctor, a physician. He's been a physician for over 20 years now, serving the Atlanta community. I'm proud of him, and I'm going to call out Dr. Darryl Sherrod's name because he's a proud young man and has always done great things in his community. But we're going to talk about the military academies of our military in the United States. And we're going to start off with West Point. And West Point has been known to have many cadets come out of West Point. And in 2020, when this article was written by Michelle Ruiz, in 2020, 38 women, 38 Black women graduated with the class of 2020, the most in the 218-year history of West Point. It exceeded the number of 34, which had graduated in 2019. So 2019, they had 34, which was the most. Then in 2020, they had 38 to top that. And there's a photograph on the internet that if you go and look it up, you'll be very shocked to see how sharp these women look in their cadet uniforms serving at West Point. And they have gone on to serve in other branches, other sections of the Army because of their military commitment. And, you know, once you could graduate from a military academy, you have to serve X amount of time in the military. And, you know, although these women of color have graduated from West Point and more will come behind them, it seems to always be that door or that wall or that barrier wanting to keep people from serving. And again, going back to the statement from former Secretary of the Navy, Forrestal, discrimination and segregation cause efficiency to be ineffective. You cannot have efficiency if you're going to continue to allow these discrimination and segregation to be a part of, whether it's be the military, your company, your family, your school, wherever. It's got to stop. So there were 230 women in the class of 2020 from West Point that graduated. 12% of the graduates were African American, 9% Asian, 9% Hispanic, and less than 1% Native American. The record number of Black female cadets came at a time of racial strife and reports of persistent racism in the military. And, you know, here it is 60 years later since World War II. And that word just continues to be a barrier. Discrimination. Discrimination. Always causing there to be problems. When does it end? But the fight of those who will not quit continue. So if it was 38 in 2020, unless there's some extreme thing that's going to keep African American women and other women of color from being a part of the West Point tradition, these women of color and men of color will continue to seek out West Point and serve. They will continue to seek it out. Then from the naval perspective, I was looking for the number of cadets that graduated from Annapolis, which is where the Naval Academy is located. And what I found was of the 175-year history of the Academy at Annapolis, women were first accepted into the class of 1980. And the young lady that I found, midshipman first class Sydney Barber, was the 16th woman selected for brigade commander since that time. She beat out 30 others for the top leadership position, brigade commander. And as a brigade commander, she has to find solutions to issues that exist in the brigade and present them to, to the academy commandant at the end of a day. Among her many duties, she's to build a team of trust and respect, hear what they have to say. They must feel critical to the mission and must touch the hearts of the people you lead. That's her belief. And as a brigade commander, she has taken that on with very seriousness and purpose. 2021, and she makes the top position at the Naval Academy. 4,000 midshipmen are at Annapolis at the Naval Academy. She is the top position. They call it a six striper. 6 stripes on her sleeve, on her coat that she wears as a commander. She has a staff of 30 people working under her, but she is in charge of all the cadets, midshipmen as they call it at the Naval Academy, at that academy, and she is in charge. Everything goes through her. She will be a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps Ground Officer Corps, and she also participates on the varsity track and field team. She is the co-president of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, secretary of the National Society of Black Engineers, and she sings in the Academy's gospel choir and is a member of the Midshipman Black Studies Club. In addition, she's also in the STEM program for mentoring middle school girls of color in science, technology, engineering, and math. Sydney Barber, Brigade Commander, United States Naval Academy. Honored position. Congratulations, young lady. Keep pursuing your dreams and good work. And then finally, from the Air Force, the Air Force first female African-American fighter pilot is paving the way for women of color. As I told you earlier, back in World War II, the WASP, which was the Women Air Force Service, was test flying planes for the military. In 2020, the Air Force's first female African-American fighter pilot, not a test pilot, but a fighter pilot, became real. Lieutenant Colonel Shauna Rochelle Kimbrell, although retired now, made her mark at the Air Force Academy by becoming a fighter pilot. She went on to teach physical ed, directed culture, climate, and diversity with the athletic department at the Air Force Academy. Returning to Colorado a few years ago, she grew up and laid the groundwork for becoming an Air Force officer and fighter pilot. As a small child, that was her goal. That was what she wanted to do. As a teenager, she began taking flying lessons, and soon joined the Civil Air Patrol, an auxiliary of the Air Force that has 3 missions. The Civil Air Patrol missions are emergency services, aerospace education, and youth development. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Shauna Kimbrell was involved in the cadet program in all aspects. She flies planes, she was a fighter pilot, and she's done a great job. So as you can see, women of color have served our country since the Revolutionary War, to Operation Desert Storm, to being a fighter pilot, to being test pilots, to serving as brigade commanders, graduating from the West Point Academy, They have done it all. I salute you all and thank you all for your time and service. I'm Earl Kitchings, the host of the Kitchings Table, heard every Tuesday morning on Awesome Radio, 106.9 FM, WBISLP, GPAC 23, Roku, Facebook Live, and YouTube. It is always my pleasure to be with you. I hope our program today has brought you some information during Women's History Month, especially for women serving in our military. The next time you see a female in the military, in her uniform, khakis, fatigues, whatever, extend a warm and gracious thank you for her service, her time, her honor, integrity, and diligence. Thank them for doing what they do to make America an outstanding military country. Until next time, I'm Earl Kitchings saying so long. See you next week.